Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for college football analysis for you, the smart fan. And this is my pet project for each and every offseason, rating and ranking the conferences. So to put this in perspective, this is not an exhaustive rating or ranking, meaning that we are just looking at the results of the games between the Power Five. So for the Big 12 here, we've got 8-8. That's against the SEC, the ACC, the Big 10, and the Pac-12. That doesn't take into account, for example, the Big 12 out of conference was 24-13. 24-13 against the FCS, the Group of Five, and the Power Five. Against the Power Five, 8-8. Against the Group of Five, 10-4. That sounds pretty good, but when you consider a Power Five and a Power 5 conference in which most of the teams went to postseason play, went to bowl games, going only 10-4 against the Group of Five, not great, and we'll look at those games as well. Against FCS competition, the Big 12 was 6-1. All right, so I've explained the rating system and the formula. If you have yet to check out that video, please do, where I explain the method. So this is what we've got for the Big 12. In those 8 games that the Big 12 won against the other 4 conferences, those Big 12 teams that won those 8 games were 75-32. And then I would add on the additional record if they won multiple games. So, for example, TCU won 2 of those games outside the conference against the Power 5, against Arkansas and Stanford. So I count TCU's record twice because they won 2 of those games. So those teams that won those games were 75-32 overall. I think this is more important, 48-27, because who knows what their out-of-conference schedule looked like. They could have been playing a lot of bad Group of Five or FCS teams. So what is telling is the winning percentage inside the conference. So the Big 12 teams that won those 8 games won 64% of their games in the conference, against teams that won just under 56% outside their or in their conference from the other power leagues. So the teams that they beat, those 8 teams, were 59-46. They were 39-31 in conference play. And then the number you see in parentheses under the wins and losses is the average seed. So I seeded all the teams as explained in the introductory video. And then I averaged the seeds for all these games. For these 8 games that the Big 12 won, their average seed was 5.08, and the average seed for the opponents were 6.8. All right, so those wins for the Big 12. So let's we see the stats here, but to remind and refresh all of our memories, who did the Big 12 defeat? Some of them very impressive, some just marginal wins. Oklahoma beat Ohio State. TCU knocked off Stanford and Arkansas. So I've explained in the past, in the introductory video, the difference between these wins because we seed all the teams because not all wins and losses are created equal. Because TCU beat Stanford. That's a 2 seed out of the Big 12 defeating a 2 seed out of the Pac-12. So that's an equal matchup. That's an even matchup, a like-seeded matchup, and a win for the Big 12, a loss for the Pac-12. So based on my 14-point scale, which relates consistently to the 14 teams in the 3 leagues, and then I adjusted the seeding as explained before, that's a good win, obviously, for the Big 12. The 2 seed beats the 2 seed in the Pac-12. But when TCU beats Arkansas, sure, the Big 12 is going to be credited with points for winning that game, but Arkansas is the 13th seed in the SEC, and TCU is the 2 seed in the Big 12. The other wins, Oklahoma State is a 4 seed, defeated Virginia Tech, a 4 seed. Oklahoma State, a 4 seed, defeats Pitt, the 10 seed out of the ACC. And if you're scratching your head saying, Oklahoma State's not the 4 seed in the Big 12, they're the 3 seed. I explained that in the introductory video. Technically, Oklahoma State in a 14-team league would be the 4.2 seed. Texas beat Mizzou in the Texas Bowl. Texas was roughly a 5.5 seed. Mizzou a 9. Kansas State over UCLA 35-17. That's Kansas State is an 8.5 seed, defeating UCLA as a 9.3 seed out of the Pac-12. And really the best win for the conference statistically, not the best win. Of course, the best wins were Ohio State in particular. But the best seeded win for the the point total here in terms of defeating a higher seed was Texas Tech as a low seed in the Big 12, defeating Arizona State, a 5.5 seed, 5.85 to be exact, out of the Pac-12. So those are the wins for the Big 12. Okay, the losses. In the 8 games that the Big 12 lost against the other leagues, their teams were 57 and 47. They won about 55% of their games. Interestingly enough, they were also 55%, 548 winning percentage, 40 and 33 in conference play. So those were some decent Big 12 teams losing out of conference games. All right, and that number is typically over 50% because when you think about it, they only played 16 games. So where were most of those games played? When were they played? They were played in bowl play. They were postseason games. Most of them, about half of them, I believe 7 or 8 out of the 16 were in bowl play. So those teams' aggregate conference record is going to be above 500 because if you take all the bowl teams and you look at their conference record, even though we've got some marginal teams going to bowl play, it's lifted up by the teams that, of course, are at the top of the league. So Oklahoma gets factored in with a 9-1 conference record, including the championship game into that. So anyway, those are the losses for the Big 12 against teams that went 64 and 41. And again, I kind of discount that. I include it, but I discount it to a certain extent. What's telling here is that Big 12 teams that won 55% of their games in conference lost 8 consecutive games against teams that were only 500 in their own leagues. And then you see the seeding difference. It's about the same, about a 7 seed for both leagues on average during these games that were lost by the Big 12. So what games were these? Georgia lost to Oklahoma in the Rose Bowl, and I'm going to emphasize and use that as an example in just a minute. USC, of course, beat Texas, and Maryland beat Texas, so those are bad losses. The second one, a bad loss for the Big 12. The 11 seed out of the Big 10, Maryland, defeats a 5.5 seed Texas, so that hurts that figure. Utah beat West Virginia. Utah was a 10.5 seed in the Pac-12. They defeated West Virginia, a 7 seed, and so that hurts that number as well. Virginia Tech beat West Virginia. That's a 4 seed out of the ACC, and Virginia Tech defeating the 7 seed West Virginia out of the Big 12. So not a bad loss for the Big 12, but another loss. Vandy over Kansas State. So the Big 12, in my projections and in my, more accurately, my statistical analysis thus far, has the worst seeded losses. They've got an 11 beating a 5. They have a 10.5 seed in Utah defeating one of their teams that was a 7 seed. And Vandy, the 12 seed out of the SEC, defeating Kansas State, a team that went 8-5 in the Big 12. Iowa beat Iowa State. That's a pretty light-seeded game. Duke beat Baylor, both of those teams at the bottom of their leagues, despite Duke getting to postseason play and winning to finish 7-6. They were actually the 12 seed out of the ACC, defeating Baylor, the 12.6, the final seeded team in the Big 12. All right, what this means is that I take the 8 wins and I average out the quality of the win. I explained that in the first video, the introductory video of the 14-point scale. So if a like-seeded game occurs, a 1 seed plays a 1 seed, you credit the team that wins the game and that conference with plus 14 points. The team in the conference that loses gets a negative 14 points. But then you need to adjust it based on the seed. So if it's a 1 beats a 1 or a 5 beats a 5, it's just a 14-point gain and a 14-point loss for the losing conference. But I adjust it based on seeding because the 1 beating a 5 seed shouldn't count as much as the 1 beating the 1. Or in this case, a lot of these discrepancy in seeds factor into this equation. So you got the 8 wins for the Big 12, and the point total is 96.24, and the loss is 114.24. So the higher this number, the worse the losses. So subtract the losses from the wins, you've got a negative 18. So before we trash the Big 12, of course, we've got to see the other numbers play out, but let's also consider how one game can affect this. So I looked at the Rose Bowl. Of course, Oklahoma takes Georgia to overtime, so this is an extremely close game among two of the best teams in college football. So let's say Oklahoma would have pulled that game out, as they easily could have. This goes to 9-7, of course, instead of 8-8. And you would tack on the quality of win ratio would go up a little bit, which was about 13 per game on the 14-point scale. So Georgia would have lifted that up. Plus, it would have been another win. So increase that by about 15 or 16, and that would go to about 110, 111, something in that range. Also, they obviously would not have lost the game. So you can knock that down by 15 or 16, and instead of that negative 18, you suddenly have about a plus 16 or 17 for the Big 12 by just that one game not turning the Big 12's way. This is what happens when you've only got 16 games to go with. The turning point of one particular game could sway this entire equation because it's only 16 games played. Of course, the Big 12 pulled out some other games that they easily could have lost. TCU against Stanford, so this could have been even worse if the Stanford Cardinal would have pulled that game out. Notable games outside the Power 5 structure. Of course, Iowa State had a nice win against Memphis. That doesn't factor into this. These are just Power 5 games. South Florida with a win over Texas Tech, so the Big 12 loses that game, but Texas Tech did have a nice early season win against Houston. Keep that in mind. And, of course, Kansas. Fortunately, they don't even factor into this at all. As awful as the Jayhawks are in football, their losses are completely in the group of 5 because they don't play anybody in the Power 5. I don't know when the last time Kansas has played a Power 5 non-conference opponent. So their losses to Central Michigan and Ohio University, fortunately for the Big 12, do not count. So it's a negative 18 for the Big 12. Keep watching the videos to find out what exactly that means compared to the other conferences. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, The Voice of College Football, right here at Mark Rogers TV.